Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today to a webinar of MazeBolt and F5. I'm Rona, I'm VP Business Operations at MazeBolt, and I'm very happy to be joined today by Josh Goldfarb, F5 Field CISO. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Rona, and thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Same as well from our side. I know that we plan to do it live as a podcast and invite you to our office. And the invite is open for another time. Currently, we are pre recording it. So we will talk about today about DDoS visibility, current gaps that we see in the market, and how organizations are moving forward today from assumed protection to proven resilience based on data. Um, so I want to start with like real stories that we see in the market, and like if we're being honest, what we're seeing today is that we're going to a lot of customers, both like me and also Josh, I'm sure you as well. And every time we're coming to ask to customers or prospects or any organizations and CISO, and we're asking them, what do you have for DDoS, and how do you think that you are protected? They're saying yes, we're protected, and it's fine. And Josh, the first time I think we met was at FSISAC about like 3 years ago. And I'm happy to know, what do you see in the market from a DDoS side when you talk to people?
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting question because I think that many organizations have had DDoS protection, at least at the network layer, in place for a very long time. And as a result, they may think that they're adequately protected against the threats at the application layer. But as we all know, to the network layer, application layer traffic just looks like application traffic. And so the network layer will pass it on to the application layer without knowing or without being able to have the context to determine if it's an application level DDoS or legitimate application traffic. And so I think that there's that hole that attackers can take advantage of, that weakness that many enterprises maybe aren't aware of, or perhaps don't realize the exposure they might have to application layer DDoS, to layer 7 DDoS.
Thank you, and totally agree with you. I think what we call it in MazeBolt is sort of a visibility gap between what everyone think and assume that they know, and what actually is happening behind the scenes with visibility. And we actually had a mutual case study about like a few months ago that I would like to share with everyone and show you basically from like a real life, how do we see it like from backstage. So I'm sharing my screen for a second. So basically, it's a real case study between a vendor, F5, and MazeBolt. And every time again, we're coming to customers and asking them, how do you feel that you're currently protected against DDoS attacks? Everyone are saying fine. But what's really happening in the market is that, like prior to radar deployment, the visibility that everyone is getting, including decision makers and CISOs, is only after an attack from the vendor. Then the vendor is very well aware of which attacks they stopped and which attacks they didn't stop. And what we see basically in the market is that like only 1%, or at least around 1%, is actually checked today with different red team testing tools. And this is where we're coming in and we want to change the picture. So we actually came to a mutual prospect and asked them the same questions. They said we're fine, but then we deployed together and showed them the results. And the results were like very, very different from what everyone assumed. So when we ran the first attack simulations of MazeBolt, which are running in a non-disruptive way, we basically saw a very big gap. We had 86 percentage of vulnerabilities, which we call misconfigurations, and only about like 14% were correctly configured with the vendor. And basically, what we wanted to show the vendors and also the prospects is that together, the important part is configuration. So we work together with F5 in this case, and we basically provided a full reports and data to correctly configure the protection layers in order to make sure that the customer will be automatically protected against DDoS attacks. And just in a few days, we were able to show a major progress and results. Suddenly, 93% was automatically protected, and the mitigation solution was correctly configured, and that's actually based on visibility. I'm stopping sharing my screen so we can actually also talk about it. Give me a second. So we are back. Um, so Josh, like from a vendor side, from F5 side, how do you see it's happening with the visibility on we're working together? How do you see finally the data is helping the customers or is helping the vendor to configure their products?
Yeah, so there's an old joke that I love. A company brings in a consultant to help them understand what challenges they have, and the consultant spends some time and analyzes their business processes. And consultant says at the end, "Okay, here's the list. Here's my write-up of my report of all your issues and challenges." And the company says, "Great, fix it." And he says, "Whoa, I'm a consultant, right? I just find the problems. I don't fix them, right?" So obviously, I'm sure we're all familiar with that joke. But the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that what was great about that case study that you showed is that at the beginning, there was limited knowledge around the issue, around the risk of the applications at play to DDoS attacks. And then in the next phase, right, similar to bringing in the consultant, there's the identification. With increased visibility and with increased awareness comes increased uh, an increased risk or knowledge of risk that was there to begin with, but there's more knowledge around that risk because of the increased visibility, and the enterprise becomes aware that there are numerous applications that have weaknesses and vulnerabilities that make them susceptible to DDoS attacks. But the best part is that then together, through our partnership with F5 and MazeBolt, we can actually remediate that risk, or at least most of that risk, as you showed. And we can not only identify the problem, bring visibility to the situation, but we can actually work together to remediate that those vulnerabilities, those weaknesses, that risk, to make the customer's application offerings more secure. And I think that is a very powerful combination of a data-driven analysis and a data-driven implementation or mitigation of risk. And I think that's a very powerful combination.
Agreed. And I think we also talked a few times about what actually we see in the market in organizations, that like it's like very small part of it is actually a technical issues, but a lot of the times we see it around even 80% of the time as organization issues between teams or between other parts in the organizations. And basically, from practice, what do you see it that from organization point of view and not a technical point of view? How do you see that influencing decision making about regards DDoS?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting topic. I think that when it comes to application layer DDoS, there are technological solutions to identify the issue and to remediate the issues. But a lot of enterprises struggle, as you mentioned, with the organizational challenges. What I think, in my opinion, they far outweigh the technical challenges. What do I mean by organizational challenges? Well, I think first and foremost, the relationship between networking, security, application owners, and developers is not as strong as it should be. The relationship is not as healthy and strong and collaborative in most enterprises as it should be. There are exceptions, of course, but in many enterprises, the security teams in particular, and in some cases the networking teams, are keen to improve their relationship with the application owners and the development teams. Unfortunately, just saying, "Hi, I'm from security, I'm here to help," that doesn't really do it. So the security teams need to take a data-driven approach. They need to show real risk, which comes from data, right? If we can identify vulnerabilities, weaknesses, other issues that allow us to show that there's real risk to the application, which results potentially in monetary loss, brand reputation damage, downtime, any other issues, that data-driven approach can help us, that can serve as a real catalyst for beginning to build that relationship or improve that relationship between security and the application and development teams. That's one area. I think also just um, the friction required in most large organizations to move any initiative forward, DDoS or otherwise, is also another organizational factor that makes it hard. And the best way to overcome that is to show value in terms of mitigating real risk and saving the enterprise potential losses of millions or tens of millions of dollars from these application layer DDoS attacks. I think that's I think that's something that's much easier to show when you have a data-driven discussion. Otherwise, it's just the security team trying to get budget for a solution without really having specific information or specific risk factors that they can show to those who to the executives, to the board, to people who might fund certain initiatives. I
We
think also,
definitely, we definitely, I think, see like similar situations from our side because we have like so many stakeholders involved in the process. So we have the decision makers, we have the CISOs. They want to have the best data for their business case. We have the networking team that sometimes is doing a lot of the work initially with deployment. We have the security team that can help them with SOC and results, and instead of like working as an incident response team, start configuring and having a data before that. And I think sometimes when we talk to CISOs, they'll say everything is fine because they don't understand how really hard the work of the security teams is in the day to day. And when we talk to networking, sometimes as well, they don't understand how much the security teams work after that. And it should be a more collaborations between everyone, that everyone should understand they can actually help each other, and then everything will be much easier if all the teams and all the people involved will collaborate together. So
yeah, that
totally agree with you on that part.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And that part you mentioned about sometimes at the executive level or other stakeholders outside security, they sometimes don't have that visibility or that awareness. Part of that is cultural. A really good CISO will create a culture where all of the direct uh, reports or the direct departments reporting into the CISO will feel comfortable raising issues. But part of that is also the need to develop meaningful metrics, which are driven by data, as we've been discussing, to be able to help the CISO understand the risk that the CISO is going to go to bat, let's say, to ask for budget to mitigate, and that's another organizational challenge that depends um, partially on culture, but also partially on the need for the security teams to be able to create meaningful metrics that the CISO can leverage and take forward. So I think also another important area that I see, just while we're on the topic of organizational challenges, years ago, say 15, 20 years ago, enterprise networks were relatively simple and straightforward by today's standards. They were usually mostly or entirely on premise. There were probably a few data centers they had a relatively well-defined perimeter, and it was pretty easy to instrument those networks, to be able to collect telemetry and data as necessary. What happened, as we know, over the last 15, 20 years is that various applications and other resources began moving out from that on-premise
On-prem, yeah,
defined perimeter, yeah, to the cloud, to private data centers, to other areas.
to
Uh,
more hybrid solutions, and then
yeah,
everything becomes more complicated.
right. So then it used to be a matter of, let's say, moving the organizational discussions forward and gaining buy-in from stakeholders to do something like mitigate DDoS. But now, even before we can get to that, we have to understand what applications do we have in what environments, what percentage of them do we have zero visibility into and no ability to inventory and manage and secure. And so we're like starting um, further back than we did even 15, 20 years ago, which I think that's another challenge because getting that visibility is not always straightforward, right? I've met with lots of customers that don't have any way to know um, if a given application owner is hosting an application in an environment. They're not given the transparency to be able to see that application and see the traffic to and from it, and be able to monitor and secure it, be able to implement policy. In some cases, they're not even aware of where these applications live, and nobody will help them understand that. And that just makes the challenge, I think, even more more difficult to solve. Again, like I said, I think many of the challenges that we see with DDoS, like any other technology or security challenge, I think are more organizational than technical.
So you think there's a lot of organizations today are like changing their mindset if instead of like thinking, okay, we deployed something or we bought a protection for different cyber attacks. Now we also need to challenge it internally and check it in and make sure that we're validating it instead of just like buying more and more solutions.
Well, I think that most of the security teams I've spoken to, they definitely understand the need to identify real risk, to have a plan to mitigate that risk, whether DDoS or otherwise. And of course, DDoS is always on that list. The question is whether or not the extent of the challenge or the problem is known, as we mentioned earlier. Um, but I think that sometimes understanding what the risk is and how that risk can best be mitigated, or what the most efficient way to mitigate that risk is, can be a challenge. Data helps, but so does understanding strategically where do I have the ability to deploy or to implement maybe more of a platform type of approach, or where do I have the ability to solve more problems with fewer point solutions? Because as we know, the more point solutions we have, the more difficult and challenging it becomes to monitor them, and to that complexity creates other issues. It can be difficult to apply security policy uniformly. It can be difficult to really have that visibility we need and to address other security challenges and issues appropriately. Point solutions, while they may be attractive as a tactical countermeasure to mitigate risk, they come with a whole host of other challenges that very often, when a security team has the ability to step back and look at these challenges strategically, there may be better ways to solve them. So I think that that's where the challenge lies, is really understanding what the true risk is, or at least getting a reasonable approximation of that, and being able to mitigate that using data to understand. And that's where I think the visibility and the data driven discussion is so important.
So, like, how can we discuss about DDoS and not talk a little bit about AI? And how can, like, we definitely see now increase because of AI and everything that is happening, both in improvement and protection layers based on AI architecture, but we also see how AI DDoS attack can be very simple even today with ChatGPT.
Mhm.
And we have like, every vendor is publishing that there is a hundreds of percentages increasing of DDoS attacks with AI now, from even to from quarter to quarter of what we saw before. So how do you see the AI involvement influencing DDoS and the need for visibility?
hmm Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's a couple ways to look at this. First of all, any AI application, most of it is going to be built on existing application and API infrastructure, or at least application and API technologies, which means that application security and API security are still important and fundamental components to AI security. That's also true when we're looking at DDoS protection, right? Because any AI application is going to have the majority of its components that are traditional application and API stack technologies that are themselves going to be vulnerable to DDoS attacks, just like any other application that doesn't have any AI. But then beyond that, we go and take something that's relatively, see, years ago, we had monolithic applications that were a request response, and they were very predictable, and they weren't designed to really be machine to machine or to be automated in any way. They were really meant for client server type of interactions with a human behind the browser or some other type of client. And then we went and moved heavily to APIs, right? We know since 2023 that more than 50% of application traffic is now API based, and this trend is only going to increase. And APIs are designed to be easy to interact with, uh, to be automated, to be easily consumable by humans or machines, by a variety of clients. And that does wonderful things for enterprises and their ability to bring innovation to market faster to meet the market demands. But it also adds a significant amount of complexity, and it adds a significant amount of potential for human oversight and other type of errors that lead to security vulnerabilities. Not to mention the fact that instead of having one or two very monolithic components to an application, we now have modules all over the place that are very dynamic and operate independently. And each one of those, if not secured properly, could potentially expose the entire application or numerous applications to vulnerabilities. Then we take that complexity and we add on top of it large language models, prompts, right? Natural language processing, all of these things that we love AI for. That it's amazing what you can do with AI, but those things open up even more vectors for attack and make AI applications even more susceptible, I would think, to DDoS attacks than applications that do not involve any AI. So I think that we're entering a new era of added complexity, increased potential for risk, vulnerabilities, and attack. And those are things that any organization needs to consider when looking at their overall strategy for securing those AI applications, to include protecting them from DDoS attacks, of course.
I think we overloaded our audience with the risk. So, if we want to give them a few tips or advices to the networking security CISOs today, of like what should you do, like as a first, second step from a non-technical point of view, how you can improve your DDoS resilience, what can you do, what do you recommend to do?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, the real fundamental building block to any discussion around security, including DDoS, is going to be around visibility, right? The security team needs visibility into the environments that are running applications and the applications that are running in those environments. Whatever APIs, AI components they may have, that's all important. That visibility, that discovery, first and foremost, is going to be important because that allows me to create an inventory, and that allows me to then take that inventory and do things like scan for vulnerabilities, look for potential weaknesses and other issues that may leave the applications susceptible to security risks, including DDoS attack. Once I have that visibility and that awareness of that risk, I can then ensure that those risks are added to the risk register, and I can begin to look at the most efficient and effective ways to mitigate those risks to bring them down to a level that I'm comfortable accepting, an acceptable level. So I think those are the initial steps I would take, and I think that data plays an important part in all of those. All of those need to be data driven. We can't guess, right? The more we can never, of course, have complete total knowledge, 100% ground truth, but we can get a very reasonable majority perspective around around visibility and data that allows CISOs and their security teams to make important data-driven decisions, informed decisions, meaning around mitigating the risk of DDoS attack.
So, like you're traveling a lot in EMEA, and I think one of the most common topics that we see today, like during EMEA, even with the US, is all the regulations and compliance that are happening in the last few years. So, like we have DORA, we have NIS2, we have the SEC. How do you see that influencing different kind of sectors with regards to DDoS? And
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is that obviously each area has its own regulatory framework, its own compliance requirements to comply with those regulatory frameworks. But what's interesting is that I think what sometimes we don't appreciate is that when we think, for example, about resiliency and sovereignty and privacy, like GDPR and others, we may not realize that obviously we need to encrypt data. Obviously, we need to make sure we can retain uptime, and that we protect customer data and that it resides where it needs to reside, and all of these different things. But what we may not realize is that if we don't protect our applications, it's possible that even if we do everything else right, attackers can get in and use those applications either to obtain access to data they shouldn't have access to, sensitive, confidential, or otherwise, proprietary, etc. Or they can even compromise the applications and use those as launching points to get inside the organization despite all the protections. And I think that's an important point that sometimes security teams might overlook, or compliance teams. They get very focused on meeting the requirements of the regulations, which of course that absolutely has to be done, no question. But compliance doesn't equal security, and we need to make sure that even if we're compliant, that we're secure, right? And that our applications are secure and protected from compromise, from DDoS, right? That they're available. All of these different things need to be in place. And that extra step beyond compliance to really secure those applications is an area that's well worth investing in and focusing in.
I know. I think like we also see with our customers that they are much more comfortable in a lot of situations instead of like working in a really a lot of pressure in incident response, moving to more proactively approach, moving to continuously validate all your protection layers, being able to do it in a regular time, no need to do it during downtime or during the night or during like very strange hours during the weekend that everyone did. And that's like very interesting. Yeah. What other topics you see overall from like organizations point of view that you think will help our audience today to move forward to a more like proactive approach to make sure that like visibility will be easier for them to do or deploy?
Yeah, I think that obviously the visibility that we talked about earlier to help understand the vulnerabilities and the risk to DDoS attack, that visibility into the environments and the applications running in those environments, that's obviously universally important. That allows security teams to really understand what risks they have, and then they can set about understanding the severity or criticality of those risks and what it might make sense to prioritize in order to mitigate or work towards mitigating. I think that visibility is fundamental. Data from vulnerability analysis, from controls analysis, from other types of analysis that visibility provides, looking at the data, really understanding the risks, that really opens a lot of doors for security teams. And when that data is missing, it's very frustrating and difficult for security teams to A, understand what risks they may have, um, and B, to do anything about mitigating them because they really don't have a good handle on the actual risk.
So I know that I invited you today to ask you a lot of questions, but do you have any questions for me?
Well, I think it would be great for the audience to understand what exactly the F5 MazeBolt partnership is at a high level, and why that's so important and attractive.
Yeah, okay. So MazeBolt and F5, we established a partnership, I think, more than 3 years ago. And basically, I think what we saw in the market and also F5 saw in the market that there is a really need to have a data, a real proven data, in order to configure any protection that there is today for the enterprises and for the customers. Because you know what we see with customers in F5 has like all solutions for DDoS overall, both on-prem on cloud. We see that everyone is buying DDoS protection and everyone feels that they're secure and they're fine. And when we're coming in and like running attack simulations, we see that something is not always fine as we thought, because if we're not continuously validating, we don't really know what's happening. And the main thing that we established the partnership is to finally give a full DDoS solution, like the future of DDoS, to the customers, how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be that both have the best protection in place, but also continuously have visibility to see how this protection is working instead of waiting for a real attacker to have us like during a night. Let's do attack simulations continuously and make sure that we're going to have automatic protection and not just like a reactive protection that like someone from the SOC team will actually need to do something at night and fix it. So the whole partnership is based on that. Give like the future of DDoS, how we see it's supposed to be. Um, Continuously have visibility, continuously validate, and together this is like a mutual solution. That there is no something, there is no other thing like this in the market today.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and a good way to summarize it. And I think that I want to pull out one thing you mentioned is that idea of continuously assessing vulnerabilities and risk. Most enterprises assess risk and vulnerability for applications, let's say quarterly or sometimes even yearly, depending on the criticality of an application. And with
Agree.
release cycles sometimes being as short as a week or even a day, or even if they're monthly release cycles, it's just not enough. The applications are changing too fast. and we need to be much more on top of understanding the risk on an ongoing basis. And I think that's a really important point as we move forward in the security field. This continuous vulnerability analysis, continuous risk analysis is going to be something we're going to have to do quarterly, yearly, just isn't going to cut it anymore.
I agree. I think AI resilience, I think it's a must today. And like both F5 AI and a lot of solutions, Maze would also have like a smart cycle AI that basically prioritize the simulations of what we see in the market. And like today, it's like sort of like a mandatory thing now to have. It's like you can't just like have something and not check it. It's just not good enough these days.
Hmm. Absolutely.
So we're almost, I think, wrapping up our time, and that's like the time that we had today for this webinar. Just to summarize everything, we discussed a few topics. We discussed visibility. We discussed ownership between the teams in the organization, and how we can do it with data security. We discussed team collaborations between the decision makers, the CISOs, also the security teams, and the networking. And we finalized with continuous validation. Josh, thank you so much for being with me today and sharing your insights about the issue. I think the biggest gap that we wanted to show here and talk about is that it's not always a technology, but it's visibility, it's understanding, it's aligning between the teams inside the organization and having the right data to make the decisions. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Josh, I'm still like having an open invite for you to come to a real live podcast to do at our new office.
Anytime.
Um, so stay secure, and we hope that you're going to join us more to more of MazeBolt webinars. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.